Well, welcome everybody today, and thank you for being here. My name is Bob Perciasepe. I'm the president of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. I think many of you know us, but I should say something very, very quickly about it. We're an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit, non-calorie organization, and one of our key things is to bring diverse interests together and to find solutions and work toward solutions for climate and energy issues that we have in the country. And today is a good example of how we go about doing that. We have top climate policy and economics experts from Brookings and Stanford. We have state environmental directors from Colorado, Rhode Island, and Virginia. And we have forward-thinking leaders from DTE Energy, Duke Energy, Exelon, and Wholesome. And we're looking forward to a really good conversation. But we're here today to talk about cost-effective and efficient ways to reduce carbon emissions. And these carbon emissions are already affecting our climate. And I think we don't want to start a conversation about why we're talking about all these market mechanisms and pricing ideas without making sure we're oriented to why we're doing it. And climate impacts are not something that's in the future. They're here and now. They're in the form of rising sea levels, frequent and intensive heat waves, heavy downpours, and without a doubt, carbon levels in the atmosphere continue to rise, and global temperatures continue to rise. In fact, last year was the warmest year on record for the Earth since we've been keeping records on this over a century ago. So when we look at what's going on in the country, we see cities and states and businesses all starting to pay attention to this and take action and develop policies and programs. And we also see that most experts will tell you that the most efficient way to handle dealing with emissions from carbon are to look at economy-wide and nationwide market mechanisms. Setting a price on carbon also sends a clear signal to the market so that businesses can make the investments they need to make and opportunities can be seized when those kinds of signals exist. I mean, you only have to look at how long it took the world to have cell phones penetrated, smartphones penetrated into our consciousness and our day-to-day activities, even when we're walking down the sidewalks, to recognize the power of the market and how quickly it can make things happen. It's even part of the discussion that goes on all the time here in Washington, although you don't hear a lot about it sometimes. Just in the last Congress, 6 proposals were actually introduced. Now, we probably all know that none of them passed, but 6 were introduced, that everything from a price on carbon to taxes to fees to cap and trade programs. So the debate continues and the discussions continue, and congressional interest is not zero on these matters. But we also know that congressional action on these matters in the near term is not really a practical path forward. It's going to take time to build a momentum and the ideas. But that momentum is continuing to grow. Last fall, when the climate summit occurred in New York City, over 1,000 businesses signed an agreement or a statement saying that they felt that there should be a price on carbon. Added to that were 73 countries, 22 states, provinces, and cities. This was a remarkable statement. It certainly is not a specific action, but it's a remarkable statement on the agreement and the consensus that exists at the subnational level that looking at these approaches is really important to solving our problem. And so we see ourselves right now in the heart of our discussion today in a time when states are really going to be pushing more and more into the forefront. It isn't that they aren't already key leaders, but the EPA proposed Clean Power Plan puts them even more on that seat of leadership. And what's core of the EPA Clean Power Plan rule is, and what's so vital to its success, is going to be the flexibility that it provides. And EPA sets a goal, and then the states innovate to meet that goal. And I always like to say, and as a former state commissioner and a former person in EPA worked on the proposal, who can be opposed to state innovation? Yeah, see? There you go. Straight from Rhode Island. No one. And but states can choose between a whole host of methods and measures, and everybody has been hearing about these for many, many months. You know, moving to zero or low carbon sources of energy, looking at energy efficiency, improving renewables, reducing demand, energy efficiency. The list is fairly extensive, and I know that there's some groups who've put lists of hundreds of things that states could consider. So there are many, many options, but what you're also going to be hearing about, and what we also know, is many states and many organizations are working very hard at how we can build pricing mechanisms, market mechanisms, or even getting ready for those into these discussions. And I think that this is really important. You know, already in the United States, to make sure that we know that this is not a wild thing. Not only is Congress actually, even though they're not acting, there's discussions going on there, but we have 10 states in the United States right now that have carbon trading programs. And then just this week, Ontario announced that it's going to join with Quebec and link their cap and trade programs, which is already linked in terms of how auctions are done with California. And if you look just in the United States, the population of the country that's in this environment where these mechanisms are in place is 25% of the population of the United States, and more importantly, more than 25% of the GDP. Already in this country are using market mechanisms and pricing techniques to tackle issues on emissions. So there are a lot of different approaches to this. There's carbon taxes, there's cap and trade, carbon taxes that are revenue neutral. There are many steps that you can take in between going all the way to a cap and trade or a carbon tax program to doing nothing. And so one of the things we'll probably hear about today as we're talking about this, what's going on in between doing nothing on this subject and going all the way to where some of the states are already. You know, things like creating common definitions and measurement and verification processes, a common currency. We already trade renewable energy credits across state lines in this country in many, many more places than the 10 states I just mentioned that are doing cap and trade programs. You know, the borders of states are kind of porous when it comes to renewable credits, and they can easily be porous when it comes to credits and trading and pricing mechanisms. But work needs to be done to get there, ideas need to be put on the table, and there's a lot of work that'll have to happen over the next year as states start to do their plans and look into what they can learn from both the academic world, the practical world of people who are already implementing, and businesses who have really good ideas on how to make some of this happen. And that's one of the keys today, is getting business ideas and state ideas starting to talk to each other and see how we can continue to push these ideas forward. But one of the key things that I also want us all to keep in our minds is that just like in the 1970s when we passed a host of environmental legislation that we still work with today that have done a tremendous amount to reduce air pollution and water pollution and manage our waste in the country, when those laws were passed in the 70s, they were built on activities and programs that states were already doing. And we need to not forget that. And so when we have states innovating, when we have states taking action, when we have states working together with the business community, what we find is examples for the national government to use to build even a more efficient system at the national level. So we should see that there's a longer term path and objective here. So keep your eye on that while we're talking today. Finally, in closing these opening comments, I want to say we're going to start off with Adele Morris from Brookings Institute and Michaelwara from Stanford Law. And they're going to set a foundation on some of the research and work that they've been doing on market mechanisms. And we're going to lead and follow with 2 panels, one with state leaders, and we have state leaders here from Colorado, from Virginia, and from Rhode Island. And then we're going to have a business panel that will also talk about how they're starting to think about this and what ideas they may have. So that was, I mentioned earlier, DT Energy, Duke Energy, Exelon, and Wholesome. So I'm looking forward to this day's discussions. I'll be participating in one of the panels with my state colleagues, and I'm looking forward to hearing our first presentation. So Adele, I'm going to turn the microphone over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you so much for hosting this event and inviting me to participate. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Adele Morris. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and I'm our policy director for our Climate and Energy Economics Project. And my research focuses exactly on the question of how to price carbon. And so I'm delighted to be here today to talk about the economic case for market mechanisms as an approach to reducing the risk of climatic disruption that Bob just talked about. I'm going to talk about the economic case, and then I'm going to turn it over to my co-author, Michaelwara, to talk about the legal case and how market mechanisms can fit into the Clean Air Act authority that EPA has. Now, as disturbing as the risk of greenhouse gases to the Earth's climate, there's one slight advantage in terms of how we might control it, and that is that the damage is a function of the concentrations in the atmosphere that come from all over the globe and all sorts of sectors and economies over long periods of time. That means that we have the option of seeking out the least cost ways of reducing those emissions for equivalent environmental benefits wherever we find those least cost approaches. And that really drives the case for using price signals and market mechanisms to find those lowest cost ways, unleashing free enterprise rather than policy prescriptions on how to go about doing that. So basically any market mechanism for pollution control uses those market forces to influence when and where emissions are going to be reduced. And as Bob pointed out, there's 2 key ways to do that. One would be through an excise tax on the carbon content of fossil fuels or other greenhouse gas emissions from identifiable sources. And the other is through a cap and trade program where policymakers set a limit on how many emissions can be allowed, establish tradable emissions allowances, and allow the regulated parties to trade amongst themselves where the market determines that price signal based on the constraints of the supply of emissions rights. Either approach can work, and economists have advocated both of these approaches. There are advantages and disadvantages to each, and some of the states we know are already engaged in emissions trading. Either way, either approach puts that price signal, and it percolates through the entire energy sector, through all different stages, everything from the production of the fuels themselves to the incentives for energy efficiency in our cars and in our homes. And economists widely recognize that there's no other policy that can work on all the variety of incentives and options for reducing emissions more completely, more efficiently, and potentially more effectively than a broad price on carbon. So now, because it's a global pollutant, as we just discussed, ideally you want that price to be at the broadest possible scale, right? So that means a federal policy and an international dialogue to have analogous action around the globe. That's the ideal, and really, ultimately, that's what's going to be necessary to stabilize the concentrations of these gases in the atmosphere. So how would that work? Well, at the federal level, I don't see any appetite to going back to the cap and trade discussions we had in 2008. So many of us are really trying to stock the shelves with policy proposals and analysis for inserting a carbon excise tax in the context of a broader tax reform. And so the hope of many of us is that the idea of pricing carbon could come up through legislation that might be motivated by other concerns as well, but then give an opportunity to price carbon in an economically efficient, economy-wide way, and then use the proceeds for other priorities such as a pro-growth tax reform or deficit reduction or whatever happened to be the exigencies driving that fiscal reform. And so I think that potential is there, and I've written about a deal I think that can be made on that. And as a shameless plug for one of the papers I think that's available that I did with Aparna Mathur from the American Enterprise Institute with the auspices of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, that's available on how to do that. And we're also releasing a book at AEI next week on implementing a carbon tax. So I hope you can join us for that. So now that's the ideal, and that's what a lot of economists have advocated for, is the new authority to price carbon economy-wide. Now we're left with, in the meantime, as Bob said, with the Clean Air Act. And EPA is forging ahead with its first stationary source category emissions guideline for power plants. Eventually, they'll have to go through all the different stationary source categories. This is the first and the biggest, probably the biggest rulemaking of my career. But it will be the first in a series under this authority if there is not an alternative approach legislatively. So we want to think carefully about how we implement that, and a lot of states are already using market mechanisms, as we heard, through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and California's AB 32. Other states are thinking about how to do this. It makes a lot of sense to think about how you can price carbon, because even under the Clean Air Act, you have so much flexibility, and a price on carbon can operate across all of those EPA building blocks, all in one policy lever. So there's a lot of strength and power to that. Now you might say, well, Adele, how do we know they're going to meet their goals? Well, Econ 101 is demand slopes downward, right? So we know that putting a price on emissions is going to lower emissions. And so the states have that tool. Now they can use a mass-based standard. They can do tradable emission rate credits. There's a variety of approaches. One approach that states probably haven't thought about that we think they should is the option to do a state-level carbon excise tax. A lot of states already have excise taxes on fuels, and they know how to do excise taxes, and all the other advantages of that program I just described at the federal level could apply at the state level as well. You could do a pro-growth state tax reform. You could use that price signal to achieve your 111D goals at the same time you're achieving some of your fiscal goals. Some states have need for new revenues. They have the potential of reducing other taxes that burden their economies and discourage working and saving in their states, and they could reform those taxes while achieving their goals under Section 111D. And certainly all of the policies that many of the policies that states might adopt will have this issue of, well, how do we know we're going to achieve our goals? That might be an issue if you do energy efficiency standards or renewable portfolio standards or anything else. All of these policies that have to be updated to make sure that you do achieve the goals that EPA has set out for you. Now, why else would a state want to consider a carbon excise tax? And by the way, Michael and I have written a couple papers describing the legal and economic case for states to have this option, is that because this is just the first rule, states should think ahead of what kind of administrative structure they might use for power plants would be easily extended to other source categories. It's actually a lot easier to expand your tax base than set up whole new cap and trade systems for every sector, because the allowances can't be fungible across source categories. And it's very easy to implement and administer. Like I said, many states already have excise taxes, and it's a fairly easy administrative structure. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Michaelwara, who's going to talk about how this can actually be done in practice under the law. And I encourage you to look on my website at brookings.edu for our papers that include our comments to EPA, and our paper is also available out in the front. You can look online. And we explain to EPA how the agency might modify its rules to make it a little easier, more seamless for states to adopt a carbon excise tax approach. Regardless of what states do, thinking carefully about coming up with the most economically efficient approach, whether it's harmonizing with other states, harmonizing taxes, harmonizing an allowance system, thinking ahead now for a future of this sort of regulation would be, I think, extremely wise, and I think EPA has shown its interest in that kind of flexibility and forward thinking. So thanks again, Bob, and I'm delighted to be available for questions after the session. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Michaelwara. I'm an associate professor at Stanford Law School, where I work on energy and climate and environmental law. And the work I'm going to talk about, I'm just going to talk through some of the legal aspects of using pricing mechanisms to comply with new source performance standards and existing source performance standards under the Clean Air Act. And this work really grows out of a collaboration with Adele and also with a number of students at Stanford who've really put in hard work on the project. Before I get there, next slide, I just wanted to show a figure that I put together that just illustrates why one might think that pricing, particularly regional pricing approaches, but the pricing approaches in general are going to be really efficiency improving step to take for states in implementing the Clean Power Plan. This just shows the EPA's own estimate of the marginal abatement cost necessary to comply with the Clean Power Plan. So that's dollars per ton that is produced using their model, the integrated planning model, really ICF's model, in modeling a state-by-state compliance scenario. And it's a little bit hard to see the numbers on that figure, but you can see that there's a wide variation from $0 per ton for some states to all the way up to $50, above $50 if you happen to live in Florida. And that really has to do with the wide diversity of emission sources, the vintage of the sources, and the relative abatement costs that implies for different states' electricity sectors. And so both within states and between states, there's enormous potential for gains from trade, or alternatively for establishing one level of emissions price that allows particular sources to overcomply, other sources to undercomply. And that's really why we're interested in focusing on this question of how do you make the policy case, but as well, how do you make the legal case for doing something that is relatively innovative under Section 111, implementing an emissions pricing regime. Next slide, please. So what does Section 111 actually say about emissions standards? Because any emissions price is going to have to ultimately be framed as a standard of emissions, a performance standard. So Section 111 defines a performance standard as a standard of emissions of air pollutants which reflects the degree of limitation achievable through the application of the BSER, the best system of emission reduction. That's the building blocks under Section 111. And I think the key word in this sentence that is most important for creating the flexibility that the states do enjoy under Section 111 is reflects, right? It doesn't have to, that implies that states can do things which produce a similar result to whatever system of emissions reductions EPA has proposed. Now, this is very broad definitional language, but it would appear to create significant space in which states might operate. Does that space include a cap, like in the AB 32 program where I come from, or a carbon excise tax, like the one that we have discussed in our two papers? That's going to really come down to how the word, a separate word is defined, standard, in that piece of the statute. What is a standard of emissions? What do we know about that? And it turns out that a little over a decade ago, there was a case called South Coast Air Quality Management District versus engine manufacturers, in which a 7-member majority of the court directly addressed the issue of what counts as a standard under the Clean Air Act. And Scalia, writing for the majority, broadly construed the term. In that case, the question was, do fleet purchase requirements that an air management district had imposed on private auto fleets count as a standard under the Clean Air Act, in the same way that, say, an emissions rate limitation on a smokestack or a tailpipe would count? And Scalia said, absolutely. Standards are things that change behavior, that lower emissions, right? He broadly construed the language, and I think that should give states and EPA a lot of comfort in moving forward with programs that don't look exactly like the traditional new source performance standard rules have, right? The rules, most recently the large municipal waste combustor rule, have really focused on specifying emissions rates at smokestacks. And obviously the kinds of items we're talking about would be very different. So, fine. I think there's legal space, and EPA also in its rulemaking recognizes this legal space to use pricing. Next slide, please. But how has EPA actually implemented this broad definition of emission standard in its existing regulations implementing the new source performance standard program? EPA defines an emission standard somewhat more narrowly. They call EPA, the agency calls an emission standard a legally enforceable regulation. So enforceability, key component of any state plan under a state 111 compliance plan, setting forth an allowable rate of emissions into the atmosphere. So that sounds like traditional performance standards at the smokestack. Establishing an allowance system. Now that sounds a lot like cap and trade, or prescribing equipment specifications. The allowance system language was added at the time that the Clean Air Mercury rule, which some of you may remember, was proposed. That was the rule prior to the MATS rule that attempted to control mercury emissions from power plants using Section 111 and a cap and trade program. It was struck down in the DC Circuit for other reasons having nothing to do with the definition of emissions standard, but this language remained in the statute, or in the regulation. Next slide, please. EPA, in the Clean Power Plan, has actually proposed to broaden even further the definition of emission standard. In particular, EPA now has proposed that any requirement applicable to any affected entity other than an affected source that has the effect of reducing utilization of one or more affected sources, thereby avoiding emissions from such sources, counts as an emission standard. Now, what the heck does that mean? What that means is energy efficiency programs, for example, things that are happening at places other than the power plants that have the effect of reducing emissions from the power plants can count. Now, that would seem to us, and this is the argument we make in our briefing paper, that seems a little odd. We think that anything that reduces emissions from the power plants and is federally enforceable, anything that is effective in reducing the CO2 emissions from power plants, or the rate of CO2 emissions from power plants, ought to count as an emission standard based on the interpretation of that term by the Supreme Court when looking at, admittedly, other aspects of the Clean Air Act, the Title II program, the mobile source program, but nevertheless within the Act. And that we essentially argue in our paper that EPA should look to maximize the flexibility for effective state policies that will reduce emissions. Now, what does this imply for using emissions pricing? Well, I think it implies that the current legal situation implies a few things. Cap and trade seems to be well within the recognized body of policy approaches that EPA can, at least under current regulation, approve. Emissions taxes levied at places where the statutory incidence of the tax is not at the power plant would also appear to be legal. In particular, that would be a requirement applicable to an affected entity other than an affected source that has the effect of reducing pollution, right? So a tax levied at the mine mouth or levied at in the natural gas transmission infrastructure, to take one example or a few examples, would appear to qualify under this standard. We think that alone shows why EPA should think at least should consider broadening their approach to allow for policies that are enforceable that reduce emissions, and we would include a carbon tax within that rubric. Significantly, the current states that have emissions pricing have all chosen to adopt cap and trade. But our view is that states that have done that to date have done that because the politics within the state support action. And there may be very different politics operating in states that are currently much broader set of states that are considering how to comply with the Clean Power Plan. And that's why we think that allowing this different approach to reducing emissions is important at this time, because while the California example may be an important one, it may be that Virginia or Kansas or Washington State has a different view on how best, given their circumstances, to cost effectively reduce emissions. Thanks very much.
This is how I get my pens. We'll leave them up here. You're welcome, Michael. Well, thank you guys for that. And believe it or not, you know, with our little bit slow start, not at exactly 9 o'clock, we're actually caught up on time. And I want to thank our two previous speakers for giving that framework for us and some of the legal underpinnings of being able to consider these things in a flexible program that states will have. And so I think our next panel is going to be with the state directors and talk to them about and let them talk about how they are starting to think about these things and how and what are the issues or challenges or opportunities that they see. So I'm going to move us right into that section. So if I'll invite the speakers one at a time and take care of saying who you are quickly. I'm not going to do your full bios because that'll eat up all the time. So I'm going to say that your full bios are out on the table. But first, Martha, if you could join, I'm going to sit in this seat. If you could join on that seat there. Martha is the Director of Environmental Programs at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. I might also say a Vice President in the Environmental Council of the States. David Paylor is the Director of the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. You sit in the middle there, David. It will get you. And Janet Coit, who's the Director of the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management. And we're really, really happy to have these folks with us, and I will join them and get the discussion going. Well, thank you all for being with us today. I'm not going to talk about baseball, which I would like to do, but those people in the audience who know me knows that I have an unending desire to do that. But what I really want to talk about is following up to Adele and Michael and my own introduction earlier, and the amazing challenges that states are facing as we move forward with this program. And I want to say just a few more words at the beginning here, and this is a lead into the first overarching question, and we'll just go down and one at a time ask you to respond, but I think what everyone needs to recognize is virtually every state is already doing some of these things. Not necessarily market mechanisms, although many are, but they're doing things related to many of the concepts that are embodied in the Clean Power Plan proposal. In fact, EPA based much of, if not all, of the building blocks for developing that best system of emissions reduction on things that are already going on in states. So I want to make sure that we all recognize when we're talking here that there's a foundation of activity that's already underway. So that's number one. And number two is there's also a foundation of planning and thinking that's already underway about how to move forward on the Clean Power Plan. And it's in that zone, based on the foundations you guys already have and on the thinking that's already going on, of where do you see these ideas in your matrix of options. And given the 15-year implementation period, there's also a degree of temporal opportunities here through time. But how are you considering some of these ideas? Where are they in your matrix, so to speak? And is this an idea that you are already talking to people about? I guess it's sort of a basic, where are you on this subject? And Martha, we'll start with you.
Start with me. Okay, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to sit up here and share some ideas and information that we're all dealing with as we're moving forward on developing the Clean Power Plan. Let me set a little bit of stage on Colorado's energy system. A little over half of the energy that we use in Colorado comes from coal-fired power plants. About 20% comes from natural gas, and about a little over 11% comes from wind. That's up from 2001, when we really had no wind energy at all, and now it's up to 11%. So we are changing our portfolio. The energy that's consumed in Colorado, a little over half of it comes from 2 investor-owned utilities that are directed from our energy regulator, our Public Utilities Commission. The remaining energy that's consumed in the state comes from, it's divided about equally between municipal utilities and rural electric associations. So we've got quite a mix of energy sources and energy, the utilities themselves that actually we need to work with in order to develop the plans. So what we've been doing in Colorado is we've been talking to our utilities, we've been talking to a number of stakeholders. We are encouraging the utilities to talk to each other about what can go into the plan, but we really haven't started a robust stakeholder process yet. That'll come once the rule comes out, and you can see, given the diversity of energy sources and the differences in the utilities themselves, that this is going to be, from our perspective, it's going to be a fairly significant challenge to come up with a plan. We've not, again, because we're not really focusing on a stakeholder process until the rule comes out, we've not really started talking about what options might be available. We've certainly, I'll say, we've not talked about looking at a carbon tax or any kind of carbon pricing program. Frankly, I think it's going to be difficult for us to pursue that, although if it comes to us, we certainly won't say no. I think it's difficult just in just the way Colorado is set up to engage in those conversations. Particularly given the rule itself, the amount of time that the rule gives to set up any kind of plan is very short, and the type of plans, the robust trading plans or the carbon plans like RGGI or the California plan, would be, frankly, in the time frame nearly impossible for us to set up. But I think that there are potential smaller trading, less complex trading programs that certainly have caught my eye. One of them is something that I've actually read from the Nicholas Institute, which is a credit trading program. It would involve a state-only plan, so it would allow the states to create their own plan and not really need to branch out and create a regional plan. But the state-only plan would then be set up to allow the utilities, either within their footprint, with other utilities in the state, or potentially interstate if you're dealing with the same currency as you were talking about earlier, to take the credits that they may have for reductions that they've made that go beyond what the state plan may require them to do, and take those credits and move them around, again, either within their, sort of bubbling within their utility, or possibly selling them to a sister utility or a different utility, either within the state or outside the state. So that is a more modest type of trading proposal that I think may have legs for states like Colorado. That just going beyond that, I think, would be really complicated. So we've not really talked about that as an option, but that's something that I think I'd be putting on the table for consideration as we work through this. With our PUC, we need to work with our PUC as well. That's been an issue that I think all states are dealing with. This is a new area for EPA. I know I'm talking a lot, but EPA really getting into an area that overlaps with our energy regulators, and that's been an issue that a lot of states are grappling with. And I think there isn't a state out there that doesn't recognize that issue and is not involved in discussing those issues with their energy regulators. Certainly we are, and we'll be developing a plan very closely with our Public Utilities Commission, with the utilities themselves, and with our energy office. So there's a lot of pieces that need to come together on this as we develop the plan. So I'll leave it with that.
Okay, well, we'll just, Martha, that was great, and I'm appreciative of the fact that, through the binary choice of, a fully loaded, let's call it fully loaded program versus doing nothing, that you are really exploring how to get started, and I think that's important. David, why don't we get that?
Yeah, thanks. Our fuel mix is about 40% nuclear. We're down to about 25% coal, and most of the rest of that is natural gas. That natural gas has been growing rapidly in the last few years, and renewable is beginning to expand. We've got some solar facilities that are being developed, and there's a little bit of wind coming along. But I would describe, the way I describe our place in this planning process right now is developing a Chinese menu, because we don't really know what the final rule is going to be. We're hopeful there's a little bit more credit for nuclear in the final rule than there was, but there are lots of uncertainties, and so we're sort of having to plan for all of the above. So we're a little bit of a blank slate in that regard. Our stakeholder process right now is one-on-one. We're talking to businesses, we're talking to NGOs, and we're getting their thoughts on what the options are. When it comes to carbon pricing, I would say in Virginia that's going to have more legs the more the business community gets behind it, and it is originating from the business community. And we're finding that much of the business community is still in the, we're not quite sure stage. So we're trying to put that Chinese menu together so that when we have the rule in July, we can then begin pretty rapidly to put together a stakeholder process that figures out, of all those options that are out there, what are the ones that make the most sense for us. There has been a push within some members of our legislature and some of the NGOs for us to just join RGGI, as an off-the-shelf solution. That's one of the options that we, if you put Chinese menu together, that's one of your options. But we don't know what Reggie's going to look like in the context of the Clean Power Plan yet either, because it includes non-EGU sources. And so, it's our view that Reggie's going to have to be reformed a little bit. So, we would, and that is something that we would look at along with all of the other options to see what makes the most sense. Market-based solutions are likely to make a lot of sense. And you talked about flexibility. That's really a key to this. The time frame that you mentioned, Martha, is a real problem. We certainly, under the all of the above options at this stage, would consider interstate, but the time frames are going to make interstate tough to meet. So maybe there's a methodology where, maybe we have a mass-based rating program or something that can start intrastate and then move out. So and we're having discussions with other states now to try to keep the maximum number of options open as we go forward and we see what the rule looks like. And energy efficiency and our renewable energy are going to be a key component of that. We're trying to figure out, how we can, the MRV and all of that, all the things that we can do to make that a key component, because we think that's got a lot of potential for us as well.
All right. Well, thanks, David. Yeah, you guys are definitely leaving no stone unturned. Might be a way to.
We're trying to be all ears to everybody, and as you might imagine, we're getting some pretty diverse viewpoints. Yeah. But we're just trying to line that all up and then make some sense out of it come August.
Well, I was interested in the comment about the insights and support of the business community. So we'll come back to that, but. I think both of you have mentioned Reggie one way or another, and we all call this Reggie for those in the audience. I think probably everybody here knows what that is, but just in case, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative of states most states from Maryland north on the East Coast, and Janet, who's here today from Rhode Island. Maybe we'll call you the ambassador from Reggie today. But obviously, when I mentioned in my opening comments that there's 25% of the country's GDP, more than 25% of the GDP already in an environment where there is some price on carbon. Obviously, Rhode Island is one of those places. So why don't you give us some insights, Janet, how you guys are starting to look about.
I'd say the water's warm. Dive on in, David. So to start out, as my colleagues did, with a little bit about Rhode Island, we have some of the most expensive power in the nation. We are some of the most efficient. We always rank right in the top 5 in terms of our energy efficiency program, and we have among the lowest, if not the lowest, per capita consumption of electricity in Rhode Island. Perhaps because Rhode Island, I think, is only second to Hawaii on the cost of electricity. Rhode Island Senator Sheldon Whitehouse and Senator from Hawaii introduced the legislation to establish a $42 per metric ton price on carbon last session, and I know they intend to reintroduce it. So that's just an aside. But for Rhode Island, so first, it's obviously so important that states have the ability to be innovative. And the states that were involved in Reggie, and at the time it was a Republican governor in Rhode Island and in Massachusetts that it was created, we really see the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative as the best system of emissions reduction. We know that it's proven. It is by having a broader scope, it can be efficient, it can use market forces, and so we've seen the emission reductions under Reggie decrease by 40% since 2005 in terms of CO2, which might lead some people to suggest that the goal is too low that EPA is aiming for. But my point is simply going to be that I think it's achievable. Rhode Island has all natural gas combined cycle electric generating facilities. Virtually 100% of our generation, except for Block Island, a little tiny place, is natural gas fired. So what that means, interestingly, is our emissions rates have gone up in the state of Rhode Island over the period of RGGI. We couldn't have achieved the reduction. We've achieved the RGGI reductions as a region, but in the state, since we have very efficient operating capacity, and that we've been generating more power. And in fact, a couple more power plants are looking at siting in Rhode Island right now. So in terms of the 111D and the Clean Power Plan, one, it would be very difficult for Rhode Island to achieve reductions if we weren't part of a regional effort. Two, we think the regional effort has worked very, very well. Three, we would welcome people to join it, but I wanted to also endorse some of the concerns about timing. It took the RGGI group several years to create the model rule, several years after the program was created to get it up and running with auctions and revenue proceeds coming back to the states. So my concern is, and I'm sure that the administrator who was part of creating RGGI as the head of the Connecticut DEP would share this, is that maybe the timeframes set out will have the unintended consequence of discouraging people from exploring regional market-based solutions. And I think that would be a shame. So I think one of the comments that have come from the RGGI group have been, if the current timeframes are not altered, that there needs to be a much more flexible approach to what's submitted and what's allowed in terms of a state that said they wanted to participate in a multi-state approach. Because I don't believe, we're also waiting, we've submitted a lot of comments. We think a mass-based approach is much simpler and has a lot of benefits, which I can go into later if time allows. But we would be concerned about the timeframes in terms of having RGGI expanded to include other states and looking at how you deal with states. I guess the final thought I'll make is, when RGGI was conceived of, there was a thought that a national cap and trade program was coming down the pike. And so there was a great interest in being ahead of the ball, and we did that. Now that we see one isn't, one of the benefits to the RGGI states from cap and trade is seeing some sort of equity or a more even playing field, while other states also have to take specific enforceable action to reduce CO2 emissions. Because we do have expensive power, and there's some problems with leakage and other issues when you have a regional approach and you have people all around it who aren't taking similar measures. So I think a regional approach, for a whole bunch of reasons, is beneficial. I think the current draft rule allows for that, but we're hoping that the final rule takes some of our comments into account and makes it easier for states to consider that as an option. And again, I'll end by saying, for Rhode Island, Rhode Island's unique. We're a million people in a tiny little area. I think we may have the first offshore wind project in the water and operating, but we really count. We're sort of at the end of the pipeline on natural gas, and I think we've done a lot to be more energy efficient and under the auspices of RGGI, but it would be very difficult to do something on an only Rhode Island approach. And finally, I'll just add that there is a local carbon tax bill that's been introduced. Some students at Brown have been working with a professor and some legislators, and it's hard for Rhode Island with our power prices and the state level taxes that we already have to conceive of a Rhode Island only approach to a tax, despite what Adele said. I think as we comment on it, we'd like to see, if there were such an animal, it be at a national level.
Okay, well, I think this is a good overview of what all of you are facing and what all of you are doing. I didn't hear any like, we wish we didn't have to think about efficiency and market mechanisms, but certainly, it's not like an easy meal, if I could use the menu thing, an easy meal to cook. But if I follow up on the meal and the recipe, you've sort of all mentioned a couple of things that might be missing ingredients to the recipe for you to be able to take some action. In your case, modifying potential RGGI approaches, and in Virginia and Colorado State, moving in that direction. Looks like some of the ingredients, like understanding that economically this is a efficient way to think about it. unlike Reggie when you started, and one of the items in the recipe now is EPA will deliver targets. You don't have to negotiate what those targets are in theory. Flexibility is another ingredient that you have, and I think Michael laid out why, you know, at least Stanford Law is seeing flexibility, and EPA is certainly following up in the proposal that they want to have flexibility, and all indications are that they will continue that way. So flexibility is a good ingredient. So what are some of the missing ingredients here? I'll just stimulate it a little bit. I mean, I've heard time. I've heard the all or nothing thinking. And maybe you guys can elaborate specifically, you know, on what would be added to the mix that would help you do more in this area. We'll start with David this time.
Thanks. Well, Virginia is instinctively a market-based preference. We prefer market drivers, and so as I mentioned before, it's going to help. Solutions are going to be facilitated when the business community can get behind certain ideas and say, you know, this is the thing that makes the most economic sense to us. The business community is going to have credibility in Virginia in that regard. So as we in a stakeholder process begin to sort of, I'll say, spiral in on what the best mix of processes are going to be, you know, I believe that market-based solutions will be a piece of that, and you know, and vocal support from the business community will it will go a long ways. We are not the most expensive state for electricity, and our folks like that as well. So, you know, there's a lot of concern about price and reliability. So to the extent that that the business community can get behind that, and you know, and to the extent that, you know, we can look at state equity is one of the things that has been talked about a lot, is interstate equity, that we're not disadvantaging Virginia or advantaging another state, and that the, you know, the solution can look to sort of even out some of those differences. That would be a huge help.
Well, I'm going to come back to that. Yeah, I want to get the other two to talk about missing ingredients for a minute. But you've laid on in your opening comments, and now again as a particular ingredient. You're not saying it's missing. You're just saying it's an important one to be there.
That's right.
In the stew, so to speak, is business support and interest.
Yeah, it's not missing, and it's probably not aligned yet. It's still, because the business community itself is going through that Chinese menu process.
So, you know, again, one of the objectives of today is to hear some of this, and also to be able to hear from the businesses in our next what their missing ingredients might be and how they're starting to think about it, because I think we'll hopefully find some of these points of intersection. Martha, how about you? Is this a helpful way to think about it?
Yeah, I would agree with really what David was saying. I think that you know, Colorado is also very market driven. If businesses come together and see that this is an option, or some market-based option is the way to go, then, you know, that certainly makes sense to us to talk about. What I am hearing, sort of the underground current of concern about doing some kind of carbon pricing is also what David was alluding to, and that's the consumer cost for energy. Colorado is pretty low. The per capita cost in Colorado is pretty low. You saw the slide a few minutes ago. Colorado would have the highest cost. That was, you know, the Stanford slide. So that was put up. So I think that the concern is if you go to some sort of market-based system, that it will drive up consumer energy costs, and I think that needs to be really looked at and understood before there'll be significant or really the necessary support in Colorado and actually many of the western states, that the economics really have to be there, both in terms of providing the incentive for it, but also on the back end, what is it going to cost the consumers? Because that's I've heard that over and over again, that's reliability is certainly the issue, but from a market perspective, it's really the cost that I think is going to be the driver.
So in that case, would one of the ingredients be more clarity that a market approach is going to be the low-cost approach? Because if cost is a big issue, which of course we'd be naive to think it isn't, of course it is. It's an important consideration as well as reliability. But if the economic theory and economic analysis is that the lowest cost method is get markets to work for you, isn't that an argument to deal with some of these missing ingredients that you guys are talking about? Yeah. But again, it would have to be, the ingredient here would have to be that show me thing.
Well, maybe as the Reggie ambassador, we have some good information that we can provide, and probably Adele and Michael have looked at it as well. That the direct-to-consumer costs in our cap and trade system are really negligible in the big picture. What we have seen is that it's because most states take the proceeds from the sale of allowances and put them back into energy efficiency or renewable programs. We've been able to also document a bunch of jobs from the increase in solar and wind. So I think that, most economists would say that a free market approach would be the most cost effective, but I think you can demonstrate through Reggie, and I think the bigger the region, the more you're going to have an opportunity to take advantage of cost savings and ensure that the market forces work. I would say on the missing ingredients, maybe this wasn't missing, but when the rule came out and we were all asked to comment, we couldn't even interpret it, let alone comment. So the rate-based to mass, I think, the more complicated it is, the more transactional costs associated with it. And for those of us who have been involved in a successful mass-based reduction program, I think a key aspect is whatever methodology to convert rate to mass, or even better, to maybe promote a mass-based approach, which takes into account energy efficiency and renewable energy in a very simple way by looking, at the overall emissions. So I think that's one thing that I'm concerned about, and the Reggie states is how complicated it will be for people who want to be involved in a regional program, or who are competition, that's the wrong word, but who are using a rate-based approach, and what is the clarity and transparency and accountability for that. So that's definitely one thing we're concerned about. And I would just say on the cost issues, I don't know why New England was so ahead on this, but I do know that businesses in Rhode Island are very cognizant of how vulnerable we are to sea level rise, to intense storms. And so I think there's very much a political will or a context in which people are willing to take action on an individual or business or a political level to address climate change.
I think a great amount of business, city, and state action is got an undertow of it, of the cost of inaction, and clearly, those are another things that get much more difficult to factor into the nuts and bolts kind of how much am I paying per kilowatt hour, but on the other hand, leadership can provide some insight into that, and there's certainly a growing body of knowledge and analysis in that arena. So that's a good point to bring up. So I'm trying to thread a little bit on this, the pieces, but one of the issues that has come up in terms of this missing ingredient kind of approach is, clearly, having modestly been involved with the proposal, but clearly the proposal actually says, we want to encourage these things. There's it was at least in the proposal of the idea of maybe more time for planning if you would do something beyond your borders. Clearly, EPA had in its mind to try to create an ingredient in the proposal that would facilitate this. The success it certainly was successful in giving the indication of their desire to not preclude it at the President's Climate Action Plan. The year before clearly said, I want EPA to do this and I want them to utilize, where they can, market mechanisms, actually in the President's directive to the agency. So pretty certain they'll keep thinking about it. So one of the ingredients might be improved alignment in pieces of how this lays out. And by this I'm talking alignment on the planning period, alignment on the interim goals, and alignment on the long-term goal. So if you think of only the planning period, maybe I can't get all this done. I don't have the infrastructure. If you think of getting something happening before an interim goal, maybe that is, and then if you start thinking over a longer period, which is by the time the rule is finalized, let's say 14 years maybe, you've got a different kind of perspective. Is there in your mind, and I know you've all commented on this rule, is there in your mind an alignment ingredient here that could help further facilitate a stepwise approach into this?
We know the right
I got a
answer
call
is
on
yes.
one if
We know the right answer is yes.
I know I was too leading a question, but Janet, go ahead.
I guess that there is if I understand what you're asking, making sure that that the very detailed approach that might ultimately be needed isn't asked for right at the end of the planning period. So, what's sufficient at what time? There's a lot of time to comply with the rule, but in terms of if you're in a go-it-alone state, you don't have very much time to submit your plan, and I think that requires that kind of alignment around what do you need to do first and make that achievable. I'll just say as an add-on, I think we're probably all in this situation, but over the Reggie period, the staff that I have to work on these issues has shrunk significantly as budgets have shrunk in Rhode Island. And so that part of the challenge for all of our states, and it's ameliorated somewhat by being part of a regional program, is simply having the staff to devote to this as we're trying to turn around permits and do modeling and all the other plethora of things. So that's a real constraint for us on the state side.
Alignment on time or just flexibility in general is going to help a lot. It's going to help a lot if we can have, a large body, especially as I've said before, of the business community, that's narrowing its focus on a particular solution. To the extent that we've got, mass-based, rate-based, solar, we've got a whole lot of different voices out there advocating for different kinds of approaches that just kind of makes it more difficult for the policymakers to focus in on a solution. And the elephant in the room, at least for some states, is there's not alignment on goals. Yeah. And so whatever the EPA plan is, there's going to need to be some alignment to get behind that, to say, okay, like it or not, this is what the plan is. We're going to figure out how to comply, as opposed to perhaps the alternative. Yeah. And so, and I think to the extent that we can, a critical mass of the stakeholders can envision a future that's got a positive path forward that gets there, a whole lot more probability of success. I will say too that for Virginia, sea level rise is becoming more and more of a motivator for a large population base, and so that's actually maybe beginning to create some goal alignment in some parts of the state that we didn't have before as well.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up earlier.
Yeah.
I know you're not on the coast, although I know that there's sedimentary rock in the Rocky
fires.
Mountains, so you used to be somewhere near water.
Yeah, that's true. We got fires and then we got floods. And, yeah, exactly.
And no snowpack.
Yeah, no snowpack. So yeah, we're
Right, so you got these
we're good
other
as well.
issues.
We're good as well. I'm reminded of the saying that the lack of alternatives leads one to clarity of vision. I think that's what we're facing, is that EPA has given the states a gift by giving us all this flexibility. Yet there's so much flexibility that trying to figure out what you're going to do in the short time frame, it is very difficult. You know, you do want businesses and utilities and all the stakeholders to sort of to drive it. I will say that on your point on alignment, one of the comments that I've also heard is we have all this flexibility, but because of the time constraints actually narrow the flexibility and require states to take action in order to meet, for example, submitting the plan or the interim goals in a manner that perhaps is not the best path forward in the long run, and certainly would make it more difficult to really achieve the right program, the right mix of emission reductions, and probably the more significant emission reductions that could occur if states had a bit longer to achieve the ultimate goal, to demonstrate that they're on the right glide path to get there. And I think that's something that I've heard with states, that it's the cliff. We've all heard about the cliff, that it means that the options may not be as there may not be as many options as one would like because of that. So, you know, I'm hopeful that EPA in the final rule recognizes that and provides a better alignment that will give really the true flexibility for states to come up with a good plan.
Yeah, and that I think is a good summary of the issue, because and I'm not talking about in this instance, although you could lay a lot of things into, including reliability, narrowing of options, et cetera. But it seems to also intersect with being able to give a very good consideration to using some of these other innovative approaches, like, you know, the diversity of different market mechanisms you could use, and work that into the plan is and how that would work. So I know EPA has been mentioned a few times, and I think we'll find that all of you have opportunities to meet with EPA. I think probably, in fairness, almost every company on the next panel will have had an opportunity, either as a group or as an individual company, to meet with EPA, or will. There's an unprecedented, you know, almost amount of outreach and discussion going on. I'd say it is, having had some experience at EPA myself, and I think rightfully so. This is an important endeavor that the country is undertaking, and it's important that we try to do it as in the most innovative and appropriate way to lead us into the future, which is one of the centroids of our conversation here today. So, you know, EPA has a role in making sure that all the right pieces are in place when they do the final proposal. I think there's probably nothing they don't know right now as they're trying to do that on how to improve on it or modify it or whatever. Let's just make that assumption. So perhaps a little bit of discussion about what you might think they could do that would be helpful after the rule, after they finalize it, in terms of roles they might play in any of this. How they look at the planning process, what they deem as an acceptable SIP. I'm wondering if you've started to think about that. What's the federal role after all this unprecedented outreach and comment, 2 million comments? I think it's the world record. How about after it's finalized? Do you want them to go away, or do you want them to? Martha, I think we're back to starting with you.
Yeah, that's fine. So, I mean, obviously, EPA is looking at putting forward its draft federal implementation plan.
Yeah.
And I think that clearly is going to be helpful for states, because then they know kind of what the federal backstop is. So having that, having you know, heaven forbid that we have more material to read, but a guidance document might be helpful as well. But I also think that what EPA could be thinking about resources for states to help them plan. I think that's critical, both financial and technical resources, I think, would be very helpful. And then as states, if states are looking at doing some kind of regional plan, to work with the states on, you know, to the extent that the states would find this helpful, but to work with the states that are looking at that, to see if EPA can help with what's the accountability piece of this, and what does that need to look like, and is that function housed, if there's enough states that are interested in this, is that function housed at EPA, that EPA kind of takes control of that, or provides the mechanism or the forum or the ability for that. I mean, I think that there's a number of opportunities for EPA to engage in the states, and I hope that it does as we move forward.
I would say don't do anything to narrow the flexibility.
Right.
And you know, and probably for Virginia, the primary thing would be we might need some tools. We might need you know, access to some of the trading tools and technology that they have, whether it's inter or intrastate, and we, you know, might need some analysis of options to help us articulate, you know, what we're getting. But you know, I wouldn't want any discussion with EPA to be seen as narrowing options or flexibility.
Yeah.
It's hard. We want flexibility, but we don't want confusion. And I think that we need resources. We need clarity. We need certainty that the things that we're putting forth or that we're investing in are going to get us into compliance. And I think that's a concern and a challenge for EPA. And I do want to say I think they have done an unprecedented and unbelievable job at outreach. But that to look at, if you're looking at a market-based regional approach that is to achieve certain reductions, I don't know, let's say there's some big emergency and it disrupts all the natural gas supply to New England and suddenly people are going to other sources. Just, it's hard to envision what would happen if you couldn't comply because of some unforeseen circumstances. So I think that issue of enforceability and compliance, and so that you have some certainty that if you're doing what you put forward, you can count on being unassailable and compliant. And then the other point is I guess just to reemphasize that the resources and the ability to get it right from the start. Bob, you worked a lot on e-enterprise, and you know, this is an opportunity, whether it's the trading tools, to right from the start use the most modern technology, make it available to all the states, and make sure that we all have access to information that demonstrates that the enforceability and the parity. And then finally, on the federal implementation plan, just it does need to be a really strong backstop so that states that are taking it on and working with the business community and making something happen see that if people don't do that, there's a specific cost or approach that's going to be borne down. I think it has to be sufficient to drive some real action and not penalize somebody a state that went forward. So I think that's an important piece.
So, I'm going to let the audience have at it here for a minute. So I've heard a couple of important things, at least here, and I think all of you sort of led me to hear a little bit on the EPA role of how it might intersect with the capacity and institutional capacity that some states have or don't have, and may not have in the near term. I know that EPA will undoubtedly try to get some additional funding, but to assume that that will happen versus make sure that there's an appropriate plan to do it, it sounds like there would be some receptivity to EPA having some role in some of the services that may be needed. I mean, obviously they run the acid rain trading and market program. They have, commodity guys and ladies who work there. So, but they obviously can have some role in that, and it seems like there's a receptivity to that. Also heard that, what I think I've heard even before the proposal, we love flexibility, but if it's complete, without boundaries, it becomes very difficult to manage. And so maybe you could call this, careful flexibility that also provides the space and the alignment of the different flexible elements to facilitate these innovative activities. I think, Martha, you said it best. If it's totally flexible, but there's not alignment on the temporal goals, it could force decisions in a different way. You all have made a pitch, and we'll have an opportunity to hear more about it, that we really need to have the business community engaged in this, and there's an engagement of how businesses look at this from their own perspective, but then there's engagement on how businesses look at this as a functioning world that they have to do business in. And so I think that was a helpful observation in the ingredient approach. And I also heard, obviously you're already doing Reggie, but I heard from Colorado and Virginia a desire to see if you could make some of these things that have an opportunity to reduce cost work somehow, or get started somehow. I'm going to turn to the audience now. We have a couple minutes here where we could take some questions. I think we have, do we have somebody with a microphone? We have a microphone person. So we have a hand there and then a hand here. He beat you just by 30 seconds.
My name is Mike Ferguson. I'm with Standard & Poor's. We've done a fair amount of thought leadership on this subject already, and we talked to a lot of utilities, we talked to a lot of IPPs. A lot of them think this is kind of a good opportunity, right? They think that there's opportunities to put in new gas-fired assets, new renewables, and get compensated for these somehow. And we talked to municipal utilities and co-ops, and maybe this is more of a question for Martha, and they're not happy about this. They're pretty suspicious of this. They think that their reliability is going to be harmed by this. They think if there's a carbon tax, it's going to disproportionately affect them, and maybe they can afford it the least. So how do you sort of sell that, and how do you mitigate some of these concerns? Because it does seem to be something that, come 2016, this could actually be an electoral issue too.
All right. Thanks for the question. Martha, you called your name.
You did call my name.
Well, you said you had all.
I should have said we have municipal utilities, but we do. We have quite a number of them. I think 29 different municipal utilities, not 29 power plants, but 29 utilities. I mean, I think I highlighted in my introductory remarks that it's going to be very tricky for Colorado to come up with a plan, because we do have entities and perspectives and positions on the extremes on this. And so what we're trying to do, we've not really started the process we've sat down and we've talked to each of these utilities to try to get their perspective. But we really haven't brought them together to sit down, all the stakeholders, and how are we going to hammer this out. We are intentionally waiting until the final rule comes out to see what that looks like. But we're encouraging the utilities to get together even now and start talking to each other about what's possible and what's not possible, and what makes the most sense for them. So I don't really have a firm answer for you other than, we're going to pull everybody together, and with the EPA, hopefully with the backstop that will be coming out as well, we'll be able to have a fruitful discussion on what's doable, what makes the most sense, and how can we move forward. And will that include some kind of carbon pricing? I don't know. As I was saying before, I think unlikely for the very because we have such a wide view of diversity of positions on this whole issue, just the plan itself, let alone carbon pricing, and just the time commitment that it would take to pull something together. But there may be some trading, as I talked about before, on the sides.
On the side.
Well, we might be only
Under the table.
Well, I'm ever the optimist, and I think conversations of this nature on these kinds of techniques are things that can bring people together when they have disparate views. And Lord knows we have disparate views on a whole host of issues, not the least of which is the climate, the clean power plant.
Right.
Right here. The gentleman did the correct thing and identify himself when I forgot to mention that, so if you could do that too.
Hi, my name's Judy Lamana. I'm with the Warrington Climate Change Group. And I'm looking at some numbers globally. If there's trading of, pricing permits, it's like a 50 to 90% off sale. And you mentioned that you couldn't have done what you did alone, that being part of RGGI really saved a lot of money. And I'm wondering if this would be a hook to get the business community behind something that the law will require or may require, if they know what a discount they can get if they join a regional group. So how much money did you save?
Well, I'm not sure how so you can look at savings in terms of the amount of emissions reductions that occurred and what that saved the consumer. But I think what I meant, we don't have in Rhode Island, the fact that we have a revenue stream from RGGI and are we part of a regional compact means that the institutions that are needed to be in place to run the whole thing are funded through the proceeds and are not coming out of our small capacity. And I'm not sure where I'm going with my answer. It's hard to quantify what we saved. The electric prices didn't go up related to being part of RGGI, and we had funding coming back in that we're putting into energy efficiency and renewables that's reducing demand and the overall costs that we're spending for power or for electricity. And I have those numbers, but not off the top of my head. So you can quantify what we didn't spend on power based on being part of that.
Yeah, anybody else want to say anything there?
I guess I would just say that we do sort of generally believe that some sort of mass-based trading is going to be one of the most economical approaches to it. Challenge is going to be if you're a low-cost energy state now, it may be the least cost, but it will in fact raise consumer prices. And so for those for whom the prices are being raised, even though it's the least cost, it doesn't feel that way to them.
This gets at the interplay between the energy efficiency program and the and how but that's not our subject today. We'll have another meeting on that.
You are, right?
Oh, right here.
Daniel Bloom, energy reporter with CQ Roll Call. You had all mentioned that the time frame for the interim goal compliance is a little bit too limiting in terms of the flexibility that's laid out in the plan. It's unlikely EPA discards those interim goals altogether, but what sort of alterations could be made to them that would make the flexibility for your states improved?
If you open your mouth, you have to talk first.
There you go, Dave.
The only measuring stick that I can think of to look at is how long it has taken some of these other groups to go through their process, which was maybe 5 years. But it might be shortened by the fact that we have some templates now, and a FIP would also create some alternatives that could encourage some discussion. But so I'm going to say, twice what, 2 to 3 times what EPA is looking at right now to really get to, a robust collective solution. It's just the challenges that we've talked about the different places that states are right now have got to be rationalized, and that's not an easy process.
Let me just add, for the RGGI states, it's completely, I think the current timeframes are completely doable because we've already been through that process and we have a system that works. But if people wanted to join RGGI, depending on what the rule says, they might be able to declare their intentions and time, but would we be able to work through how we bring in a state with a totally different circumstance into it in the time frame is the question. And nobody wants to, including EPA, do what Martha said, which is reduce the motivation to do a cap and trade because you're rushing to meet a time frame.
I think it's a key issue they got to deal with in their final.
Right, yeah, I guess, I mean, same thing. I think that in Colorado in 2010, we passed the Clean Air, Clean Jobs Act. And that went through very quickly, but the implementation of that started in 2010 and it goes all the way up to 2018. And just the planning of reliability, you know, making sure that when you're implementing the plan, that you're ensuring the costs and the reliability are there. So we've had a number of plants, coal-fired power plants, that have either shut down or switched to gas, which is the same thing essentially. And that process has taken, you know, here it is 8 years. So if you've got this requirement to achieve a certain level of reductions by 2020, we wouldn't have been able to do the Clean Air, Clean Jobs Act, or at least much of it, because we wouldn't be able to get that accomplished. So I think the concern is you're trading perhaps more efficient, maybe more emission reductions for sooner reductions, so that you can start achieving some, you can showcase that you're actually doing some really good things. And I think that there needs to be a recognition that faster is not necessarily better, and there has to be an accommodation for that.
So we're just about out of time. I have 2 more hands. So what I would ask you to do is state your name, rank and serial number, and your question, and then Ellie, come over here to this one other lady who has her hand up and get the same thing, and then we'll get the panel to respond to both of them. Okay, and that'll be the end of this panel. So go ahead.
Okay. Name, Daniel Erickson. Rank, I don't know. I work for a company called Valuetus, and I guess the question that I have is putting the solutions hat on about this time frame question. From my perspective, there are kind of 2 parts: the process or the technical aspect, and then there's kind of the political or organizational or what have you, kind of support building aspect. Now, my experience is that the technical aspect, tools and templates and so on, can really help. Just as a personal example, what took the City of Manchester in the UK about 3 months to set carbon goals, I built a tool that does it in about 2 hours. But that's not necessarily, I'm not sure if that's the problem, or if there's an organizational issue that takes much longer than a technical process. So I'm wondering what the solutions are that you might see for this time frame issue you're raising.
Okay, so let's.
My name is Catherine Morris, and I'm with the Consensus Building Institute, which you might imagine my interest is in hearing more about your stakeholder engagement and where you are in your thinking about who falls within that definition. We all have sort of in the minds of the beholder a definition of who the stakeholders are. And if you've given any thought to what kind of process you would consider in terms of bringing them to the table and maybe going beyond just the standard get their input, but actually try to engage them, much like Reggie process did in trying to come up with actual proposals for the state.
Okay, so we're going to have to go quickly. So one is on solutions to alignment of time and effort, and the other one is your stakeholder.
Well, I think she's the answer to his question. Yeah. and that is...
we didn't set that up.
The more... we're going to have stakeholders, and the more stakeholders we have aligned around it, the more likely we are to be able to move forward. If the state is fractured and doesn't get a critical mass of folks pointing in one direction, it's going to be very tough.
So, organizational structure, I like the way you put that, as opposed to sort of the politics of it. That is a big issue. In Colorado and many states, we have to have legislature involved, in approval of whatever we submit to EPA. So there is going to be that issue. I think organizationally getting stakeholders, all the stakeholders involved and behind it, the critical mass there. We're not going to achieve complete consensus, but if we have a critical mass there, then that'll help us move forward, and that's what we're looking at. Our stakeholder process, we've developed stakeholder processes for a variety of different rulemakings and SIP proposals in the past. We generally have all comers, whoever wants to participate. It is an open, and it is a dialogue. It's not our talking or taking notes. I mean, it is a back and forth, many meetings, and we'll have small groups to get together and side groups. I mean, it is a pretty involved process. So, and that'll probably go on for 6 months before we take any action.
All right. Well, I'm gonna call it a panel. Really thank you guys for doing this and sort of putting yourselves out there a little bit. I think the conversation has laid out the desires as well as the challenges, and I think we're all looking forward to conquering the challenges and seizing the opportunities as it goes. Our next panel will be a business panel. Vice President of the Center, Jeff Hopkins, will be your new host for that.